So we're going to do the sheep eye today. So you should have in front of you your sheep eye. Now, some of the sheep eyes still have part of their eyelids and eyelashes intact. If you want to, if it's sort of creeping you out a little bit, you can cut those off because they're not really necessary. So we're going to cut those off. So as we look at the eye, you can see in the front here, this is the cornea of the eye. The cornea normally should be a clear and transparent structure, but because this is a non-living animal, plus it has been in the preservative, the cornea has lost its transparency. The rest of the eyeball is the sclera. So the sclera would be the white of the eye. The sclera is very tough. It is made up of a very dense connective tissue. And in general, there are not very many blood vessels that will penetrate this tissue. Attached to the eyeball, you will typically find some yellow adipose tissue. The eyeball is packed within the orbit with fat, so there'll typically be some adipose tissue attached. But you may also see some more pinkish gray structures, like you see here. These pinkish gray structures are the extrinsic eye muscles. So there should be 6 of these, if you look hard enough, that will attach to the outside of the eyeball. On the posterior of the eyeball, on the opposite side of the cornea, you will typically see a oval structure here, a round structure that might stick out a little bit. It's embedded in the fat that you'll see on the back of the eyeball. You see it right here. This is the optic nerve leaving the back of the eyeball. So it's usually this little nub, circular nub on the back of the eyeball. If we again look at the anterior of the eyeball, where the eyelashes and eyelids were, you will see an additional layer of connective tissue that overlies the anterior of the eyeball. So you see right here, this additional layer of connective tissue. This additional layer that goes over the inside of the eyelid and then goes over the anterior of the sclera up to the cornea is called the conjunctiva. The conjunctiva has many blood vessels running through it, and it will give your eye, when the blood vessels in there are irritated, the bloodshot appearance. The inflammation of the conjunctiva is called conjunctivitis, otherwise known as pink eye. You will also notice on the border between the cornea and the sclera, it's typically discolored a little brown. Everybody see sort of that brown discoloration on the border between the cornea and the sclera. The reason for the discoloration is because that is the location of the canal of Schlemm. So the canal of Schlemm would be located here. It is the drain for the fluid that you would find in the anterior part of the eye. The fluid that you would find inside here in the anterior part is called the aqueous humor. So that would be found here in this anterior part of the eye. At this point, we are going to cut the eye open, and we're going to cut the posterior cavity away from the anterior cavity. So the anterior cavity is the anterior part of the eye. The posterior cavity is the majority of the posterior of the eye. And we want to do this with minimal squirting of the fluid that is found inside of the eye. We do not want anybody to get the fluid into their eye. So the way that I do it, what we're going to do is we're going to cut in a circle all around the cornea, about maybe 3 or 4 millimeters away from the edge of the cornea. We're first, to be able to get through the sclera, going to have to puncture it with our scalpel. So to do that, I like to puncture down so that it will, all the fluid that is in our anterior chamber, our anterior cavity here, our aqueous humor, will flow down into my paper towel. So I'll puncture it by pushing down like this. So I punctured, and as I punctured, you see that there was a watery substance that oozed out. And then I'm going to get my scissors and put it into the puncture hole, wherever I put my puncture hole, right there, and then cut around. And as you do this, you see that more fluid is leaking out. So all of your aqueous humor is leaking out of the eye. And you pray for sharp scissors. So if you didn't get a sharp scissors, you might need to go back for what? Okay. And you see my eye here is now, the front is cut away from the top, and I'm going to lift my eye, front of my eye straight up. And then you'll have something like this. On the anterior side of my eye here, you'll see that there is sort of this jelly fluid that you find within, it would be in the posterior cavity of the eye, so that's where it would be located if we put it back together. This jelly-like fluid is the vitreous humor. Okay, so the jelly-like is vitreous humor. And typically it will stay attached, so I'm going to try to sort of push it out of the anterior part of my eye. Might need to use my probe a little. The aqueous humor, remember, is the stuff that oozed out when we cut it open.
So where does that normally do that?
That's normally in the anterior cavity.
So what's left in that other part, would that be?
Well, this should be all vitreous humor back here. But again, when we pulled it apart, some of the aqueous humor kind of flowed in the back but that's why there's a little bit of water in there. So, flip it over. Okay. So now attached to the vitreous humor, you see this sort of hard structure. This is the lens of the eye. Okay. So here's our lens of the eye. It will attach to the rest of the eye through suspensory ligaments, which you can't really see, but they would attach to this black stuff that's usually attached to the outside of the lens, which are the ciliary processes. If we concentrate on now the anterior part of the eye, I am poking my probe into the pupil of the eye. And the pupil, on the other side of the pupil, there's the cornea. Surrounding the pupil, you will see this sort of very thin and smooth black structure here. So you see this smooth black structure, and you'll see it on both sides. This is the iris. Now remember, these sheep do not have round pupils like we as humans do. Instead, they have more the elongated pupils like you see in cats and dogs, and other animals. So that's why we're seeing more of an iris flap on one side and then another iris flap on the other side. Surrounding the iris, you see this lined structure. It sort of has a little sunburst pattern, or students like to say that it looks like the underside of a mushroom. Okay. This structure are the ciliary bodies, and in particular, they're the ciliary muscle part of the ciliary bodies. Typically, the processes get ripped off and are stuck over here with the lens. Okay. So the ciliary body is a combination of these ciliary muscles and the ciliary processes and the suspensory ligaments. The suspensory ligaments hold the lens in place. Now normally the lens would be located right here. The lens is the divider between the anterior cavity, to the anterior, and the posterior cavity, to the posterior. The posterior cavity is filled with vitreous humor. The anterior cavity is filled with aqueous humor. The anterior cavity is also divided into two chambers. The anterior chamber is from the cornea to the iris. The posterior chamber of the anterior cavity is from the iris to the lens. Okay, so if we put our lens back in there, it would be from here to the lens. Both are filled with aqueous humor. Let's focus on the posterior of the eye. Okay. So in the posterior of the eye, you should see that there is a cream color layer, and you can kind of mess with this a little bit by pushing it out of the way to kind of see that it's a layer there. That is the retina. The retina is where most of the neurons in the eye are located, especially the photoreceptors. Now these neurons will have to have axons that leave the eye and go through the optic nerve to the brain. They all leave the eye in one location. So you see that sort of there's a spot here. If you pull all of this together, there's a spot right here where the retina we push the retina around and sort of move it out of the way, where the retina will stay attached at all times. So you see it's staying attached to this spot right there. That's where the axons are leaving. That is called the optic disc. Okay. When you pushed your retina around like this, you have detached the retina of this poor sheep's eye. Okay, we've now detached retina, which is okay. You needed to do that so that you could see the layer underneath. The black layer underneath is the choroid. Now the choroid of the sheep eye has a special layer that you see as this iridescent blue, green, yellow layer. This layer is called the tapetum lucidum. So the tapetum lucidum is found mostly in animals. We don't have it on our choroid, especially in nocturnal animals. It helps them see better in the dark. It also makes their eyes very shiny in the dark because it reflects light well. Okay, so when you see animals in the dark, dogs, cats, raccoons, deer, it's because their tapetum lucidum is shining the light back at you.